Hello, I'm Chrissy Seaton and welcome to my channel. Today we are continuing on with the fourth video in a series called The Patriarchs, and at the moment we are talking about Abraham. And today's video is going to center on Genesis chapter 13 verses 1 to 9. So, let's get started. Now, as usual, I will read you the verses taken from the Humish, and I will read Genesis chapter 13 verses 1 to 9, and then we will go right into the commentary that is associated with those verses. So here we go. So Abraham went up from Egypt, he with his wife and all that was his, and Lot with him to the south. Now Abraham was very laden with livestock, silver and gold. He proceeded on his journey from the south to Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at first, between Bethel and Ai, to the site of the altar, which he had erected there at first. And there Abraham invoked Hashem by name. We're going down to verse 5 now. Also Lot, who went with Abraham, had flocks, cattle, and tents, and the land could not support them dwelling together, for their possessions were abundant, and they were unable to dwell together. Verse 7, and there was a quarrelling between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And the Canaanite and Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. Now verse 8, so Abraham said to Lot, please let there be no strife between me and you, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not all the land before you? Please separate from me. If you go left, then I will go right, and if you go right, then I will go left. So that's as far as we're going today in this video. So now, while that is all fresh in your mind, let's now take a look at the Torah commentary on this. And there's a broad introduction, and then we'll go right into it. So we're starting with verse 1. The return to Eretz Israel. So Abraham went up. Although it is literally true that Abraham ascended because the terrain of Eretz Israel is higher than that of Egypt. The Zohar perceives in the verb the additional indication that Abraham ascended spiritually from the lower degrees of Egypt. He left a place of spiritual pollution and returned to his former higher condition. Unlike Adam and Noah, who did not regain their former eminence after their lapses with the tree of knowledge, and of course Noah with the wine, Abraham emerged from Egypt unscathed and undiminished. There you go. To signify this resumption of his original mission of proclaiming God's name, Abraham returned to the altar where he had declared his devotion when he first arrived in the land. Very true. Now, commentary verse 3. On his journeys, the implication is that these journeys were part of a known itinerary, implying that Abraham lodged in the same places where he stayed on his way to Egypt. The sages comment that the Torah mentions this insignificant detail to teach proper etiquette. One should not change his customary lodgings unless he has suffered harassment and anguish there. Otherwise, one discredits himself, as he will be considered hard to please or disreputable, or he will give the impression that his lodgings were unsatisfactory, thus harming his host's reputation. Alternatively, he went to the same place, so this is the alternate explanation, he went to the same place to pay the bills he had incurred on his trip to Egypt. The teachers of Musa, which means ethics, derive a lesson in frugality from Abraham's behaviour. On the way to Egypt, he was not yet as wealthy, so he must have used inexpensive accommodations. On the way back, though, he was much wealthier. He did not waste money on unnecessary luxury. Interesting. Now we move on, explanations on verses 6 to 9. And the subheading here is Abraham and Lot part ways. Wealth and the lust for more of it brings out the worst in people. Yes, it does. Abraham resisted it completely, but Lot allowed it to warp his judgment until, as the succeeding passages indicate, it destroyed nearly all of his family. It began when there was insufficient pasture for their abundant flocks. This caused Lot's shepherds, with his support and a convenient rationalisation, to resort to thievery. Comments that the land was surely spacious enough to accommodate 2 families. Rather, the source of the problem was the quarrelling between the shepherds. So that's the herdsmen that belonged to Abraham and the herdsmen that belonged to Lot. And when people cannot get along, even the most spacious land is too small. Heard that saying? Can't put enough distance between A and B. So, and there was quarrelling. Lot's dishonest shepherds grazed their flocks on other people's pastures. When Abraham's shepherds rebuked them for this, they responded that God had promised the land to Abraham. And since he was childless, Lot was his heir. Remember, Lot is Abraham's nephew, his brother's child, Abraham's brother's child. The verse specifically negates this contention by emphasising that the Canaanites and the Perizzites were still in the land. Abraham had not yet become the legitimate owner. Point to keep in your mind. We go on with explanation on verse 8. Please let there be no strife. Now, Abraham wanted peace, but he understood that the only way the 2 families could avoid strife was to separate from one another. So too in the future, God in his wisdom decreed that Israel was not to be friendly with Lot's descendants. That's referred to in Numbers chapter 21 verse 5 if you want to look at that. For anyone who tried to show them mercy would suffer humiliation and war. The Torah loves peace, and Abraham exemplified peace. The Torah loves peace, but any person who seeks peace in opposition to the wisdom of the Torah courts disaster. Abraham bowed to God's wisdom when he said to Lot, "Let there be no strife, separate from me." So now that brings to a conclusion the Torah, verses and commentary. Now, as is our custom, we will switch over now and look and see if Torah Anthology has anything extra to add, any layers, any extra information. So let's take a look. So, we're looking at, again, Genesis chapter 13, verses 1 to 9. So we begin with a little explanation. Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife, all that was his. and with him he had Lot, his nephew, and they went to the Negev. You've probably all heard about the Negev desert. Now, Abraham was very rich, and livestock, silver, gold, he had lots of things. So this is where they went. He continued in his travels, and the place where his tent had been at first. Now, and the site of the original altar was made there. So just bring you up to speed. Now, the explanation here, the Negev is in the south of the Holy Land, since Egypt is to the southwest of the land of Israel. As soon as Abraham crossed the border, he was actually in the Negev. You've probably all heard of the Negev desert. The Negev is in the south. So the Torah states that he continued on his travels, or more literally, he went in his travels. Now, this indicates that when he returned to the Holy Land from Egypt, he stopped in the same inns that he had stopped in when he went to Egypt. He did this in order to repay his debts during the time of famine when Abraham was in financial difficulty. He may have borrowed money from a number of people. Now that God had given him wealth, he wanted to repay his debts. No, Abraham would never cheat someone who he owed something to. So there's just a slightly different opinion, none of, all of which don't distract from the principle and the teachings here that we learn. It also goes on and says, because Abraham was very careful with his debts, he did not attempt to repay them through using an agent or a messenger, and he made that restitution in person. He went and paid them in person because there was always a chance that an intermediary or an agent may be not, shall I say, quite so principled. They may avoid making the full payment or perhaps not make it at all. Abraham paid each innkeeper exactly what he asked without trying to haggle over the price. Now, goes on and says, Torah informs us that Abraham went to the place where he had his tent at first. This teaches us that it is not good manners for a guest to change his place. And how often do we, when we travel somewhere, we've been doing it regularly, there's a particular hotel or, I don't know, bed and breakfast, whatever it is, and you always like that. There's something about it, the people, the service or what have you. So you tend to always want to go back there, don't you? Because it's a good feeling, good relationship with the place. So it was the same back then as well. Now, we're going to skip on a bit further now. The Torah therefore says that Abraham went to the place where he had his tent the first time. He stayed in the same place on his return as he did when he first arrived, not changing even his lodgings. So we've come to understand there's probably a couple of reasons other than the fact that he liked where he stayed. The land now, Lot, who accompanied Abraham, between the two of them, they had a large quantity of sheep and cattle, tents, etc. And they couldn't be sort of living together all the time. Their wealth was so great that it would make it difficult just in the logistics of feeding their livestock. Torah informs us that Lot was worthy of all his wealth and honour only because he accompanied Abraham. So don't forget, Lot was also a wealthy man at this stage. As a result of his accompanying Abraham, Lot also deserved to be the ancestor of two precious jewels. I love the way this is put. Ruth the Moabite, who was the great-grandmother of King David, and Naamah, the Ammonite, who was King Solomon's wife. And it goes on and says, Lot would never have been worthy of this on his own, but because he accompanied Abraham wherever he went, he never left his side, he was worthy of these things. So you hear statements saying guilty by association, but in this case it was righteousness or benefit by association, particularly for Lot. So we go on. I've already discussed that they had lots of livestock. Now we'll go on and see here. It says Lot's herdsmen were wicked and would graze their animals in other people's fields, not considering it theft. The argument was as follows: God has already promised all the land of Canaan to Abraham. Abraham is already old and he has no children. Therefore, Abraham cannot have a child, and they concluded that Lot will inherit all that Abraham has, and therefore all this land at this time actually belongs to us. One should never assume, should they? They went on to feel that we can graze our livestock wherever we please. Now, it is forbidden. As long as he was alive, it was forbidden to take his property without permission. Without question, it is forbidden for a son to steal from his father, even though he will eventually inherit his father's possessions. One who robs his father and mother and says it is no sin is a colleague of the destroyer, and that's in Proverbs chapter 28, verse 24. He is no less destructive than any other thief. So, if, on the other hand, they argued that the land did not belong to Abraham yet, their sin would have been even greater. They would be stealing pasture from many people. Now, since Abraham had no offspring, this could mean no one else but Lot would be his rightful heir. Abraham had raised Lot as a son, and the two had been together since Lot's childhood. So there's been a long association between these two individuals. And at this stage, Lot was his only heir. Now, Abraham managed his affairs. But anyway, Lot's argument was, and I think based on the age and the past circumstances, he assumed that, you know, I'm in here. I'm going to get everything anyway, you know. Now, Abraham, I want to just read this and add a little bit of insight. Abraham managed his affairs with the strictest of honesty. When his animals were taken out to graze, they would be muzzled so that they were not able to graze in fields belonging to others. That would be on their journey to their designated grazing spot, so that they would not be able to graze in those fields. He gave his herdsmen orders that the muzzles not be removed and that the animals not be allowed to go through the fields belonging to others. They would only use the public highways. Abraham's herdsmen therefore reprimanded those of Lot for trespassing on private property. Abraham has not yet taken possession of the land of the Canaanites, and even we do not trespass on their property. They still actually owned the land. The Torah says there was a dispute between the herdsmen, and we'll continue on with that. But I just want to give you even some principles that apply even in this very day and age. In England, and certainly in Australia, we have parcels of land that are called the common, and they would often be associated with villages, etc., and things like that. So although there might be large pastoralists and farmers, etc., that own their own land privately, the local government, etc., would put aside a piece of common land. That's what it's called. So therefore, if you were travelling or what have you, you would be able to rest your livestock there, feed on the grass, have water supply, etc. It would be fenced so that your stock would be safe. And then you would move on to the next one. commons aren't that much used now, except just, the kids in the local little village might have a pony, so they put the pony in the common. They're not used in terms of large herds of livestock. What we do have now is have people who are what we call droving. That a drover is a person that has his horses, his dogs, his equipment, tent, truck, usually a big truck nowadays, and they graze stock along the public stock routes. And that is particularly available in times of severe drought and famine, where people have got starving stock, etc. It's perfectly legal. You get a permit to do it, and you can drive your stock safely with appropriate safety signs, etc. You just let them walk slowly and then rest them for the night, and then they just slowly graze along. Now, here's the interesting thing, and I know this because many years ago my father was a ranger for the Pastures Protection Board in Australia, and one of his jobs was to check on the drovers that they had the proper permit to drove, how many head of stock they had, check their brands, make sure they weren't picking up somebody else's brand on the way. And often there would be more than 2 or 3 mobs of cattle or sheep, often, on the public stock routes at the same time. And there had to be a certain distance between those particular mobs and individual drovers, because the land had to and they had to move on. I think it was 5 miles a day then, or it was miles then. Don't quote me on that. It's a certain distance you must move your cattle on as they're grazing. It's slowly. You can't let them eat out one spot and then move on and eat out the next spot, stay for a month or whatever, because there's other drovers coming along with their stock who are hungry. So there is a moral and legal obligation to not deprive another herdsman or drover of grass and water that is their right to have in a public capacity. I just thought, for what it's worth, I would mention that, because we still have leftovers of some of these principles we have just been speaking about, be they in a different time and slightly different parameters surrounding it. But respect for the other people's herds is still very much, it started out many years ago as a gentleman's agreement, and then it became actually legislation. And to my knowledge, it is still in existence today with very few changes. Thanks be to God. So, I'm sorry I digress, but sometimes there are interesting factors that just add a little, bit of, how shall I say, understanding of, how laws that were made back then are still in play today. So, at the time, the Canaanites still were in possession of the land. Abraham did not have rights to the land during his actual lifetime. God told Abraham, remember this, to your offspring I will give this land. This indicates that the land would not belong to Abraham personally himself, but only to his offspring. This was a promise that he would actually have children, of course. Now, this is the dispute that went between the herdsmen. The debate also went on between Abraham and Lot themselves, since Lot's men were not careful regarding private property, and I guess whatever things were associated with them. Now we're going on to verses 8 and 9 in chapter 13. Abraham said to Lot, let there not be strife between me and you, and between your herdsmen and mine. Now Abraham then decided to separate from Lot. There were 4 reasons for this decision. I'm just going to briefly touch on these. The first one was Abraham was worried that the combined numbers of his and Lot's flocks, livestock, would alarm the natives or the local people living there. And, we're talking big, as we'd say today, big mob of cattle, big, there would have been goats, sheep. Number 2, Lot was very stubborn, and Abraham was constantly involved in disputes with him. So there was ongoing friction. Number 3, there was a very strong physical resemblance. Now, this is interesting. There was a very strong physical resemblance between Abraham and Lot. And that's understandable. Abraham and Lot's father were brothers. Therefore, Abraham did not want to remain in the same place as his nephew. People who heard about the dispute thought that Abraham was wicked, the wicked one, who did not care if he grazed on private property, and that Lot was the honest one who was reprimanding Abram. The Torah therefore reports that he said, "Let there not be strife between me and you, for we are brothers." At the end of the portion of Noah, however, we saw that Abraham was Lot's uncle, which we understand is true. The reason that Abraham called Lot a brother was because of their physical resemblance. So people confused the two and did not know which one was wicked and which one was honest. Abraham was apprehensive that if he remained with Lot, his good name would be ruined. Understandably so. And the 4th reason was that with divine inspiration, Abraham foresaw that Lot's descendants, Ammon and Moab, would be hateful in God's eyes. We later see that God prohibited these nations from intermarrying with Israel, even if they converted to Judaism. And that is referred to in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 4. Now, because of these 4 reasons, Abraham told Lot to separate from him. He could not tolerate his wickedness. Abraham went to the south while Lot went to the north. God told Abraham to walk the land, and when Abraham did this, he took possession of the land by pacing it out. Stepping it out means taking a rough calculation of this area. From that time on, the land of Canaan belonged to Abraham. The Israelites then were able to take possession of the land as an inheritance from Abraham. Abraham took legal possession of the land at God's word. Israelites inherited from him legally. Now, God had said to Abraham, "I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth." Now, this is interesting, and it really resonates when we look back on the history of the Jewish people and the difficulties. "I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth." Now, there are 5 allusions in the use of this simile, meaning dust of the earth. So the first one says, the first allusion, impossible to number all the particles of dust in the world. They would become so numerous that it would be impossible to count them, meaning the Jewish people. The second allusion relates to Israel will be scattered all over the world. No place where Jews are not found. And that is pretty true today as well. One might question this kind of a blessing saying that the Jews will be scattered upon over the homeland, together in their homeland and abroad all over the world. But there is actually an answer to this, and it says that, in a way we have to say that God did a great favour to the Jews in some ways in scattering them all over the world, since it's now impossible to destroy all the Jews. And haven't we seen that? Many have tried. Some have had some success, but in the end they've all failed. The Jews are therefore likened to dust, since there is no place without dust. There you go. So next time you're dusting your furniture, think of that story. Think of that. Notice the dust and think of this story. I know I will never dust without thinking of this again. True appreciation. The third illusion was that just as dust is tread upon by all, so are the Jews who are modest and humble, and that is true, very true. True appreciation of the Torah exists only among people who are modest and humble. Only such people can receive the full benefit of it. And there is not sort of anything else now relating directly to these verses that we have read, being Genesis chapter 13, verses 1 to 9. There is, if you go to my website, which is linked in the description box below, there is a page called Documents page, and if you go there, you will also be able to double check the Torah anthology reference details and my Humash or Torah and the details of that there. If you're wanting to. And also, don't forget, in the description box, I will link an online link for you to go straight to read what we have discussed in this video, along with the addition of comments made by Rashi. So there's lots of things there you can read. You don't have to have a Torah to be reading this. You can read it online through this link that I put in the description box. So we've looked at quite a few nuances of information. So when you read the actual verses in Torah or any biblical verses, there is a lot behind those verses. You know, Torah does not waste a word. God does not waste one dot, one stroke, one word. Just remember that. And that is why we do have to broaden our understanding sometimes by reading the comments and the explanations and the differences of opinion. They're important too. So, until next time, until I do the next video, which will be video number 5, please avail yourself of those resources online. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not a subscriber. And those who subscribe, God bless you and thank you all very much. In the meantime, you take care and God bless.